Before we talk about who built the mounds, we need to talk about the mounds themselves. Because if you have never stood at the base of Monk's Mound in Cahokia, Illinois, the numbers alone do not prepare you for what you are looking at. This structure covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises in terrace stages to about 100 feet. It was built without metal tools, without the wheel, and without draft animals. That is not a theory. That is a measurement. And Monk's Mound is not alone. Across the eastern half of North America, from the Gulf Coast up through the Ohio River Valley and into the Great Lakes region, there are tens of thousands of mounds. Some estimates place the number at over 100,000 before European settlement and subsequent land clearing. The majority of those that survived into the modern period have been documented, surveyed, and in many cases excavated. What those surveys found is where things start to get interesting. The shapes are not random. Conical mounds, flat-top platform mounds, and effigy mounds built in the shape of animals or geometric figures appear at sites separated by hundreds of miles. The Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, stretches over 1,300 feet in length. From ground level it is nearly impossible to read its full form. From above, the shape is precise. The curves follow consistent proportions. The head aligns with the summer solstice sunset. That alignment was not an accident, and it was not unique to Ohio. At Newark, also in Ohio, a complex of earthworks covers over 4 square miles. The circular enclosures, octagonal enclosures, and connecting avenues are laid out with geometric accuracy that continues to draw serious academic attention. Researchers from Earlham College documented in the 1980s that the Newark earthworks encode consistent lunar alignments, specifically tied to the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle. Encoding that cycle into a landscape requires sustained observation over generations and a level of mathematical planning that is difficult to dismiss. The platform mounds at Cahokia tell a different kind of story. This was not a ceremonial site on the edge of a settlement. Cahokia was a city. At its peak, around 1100 CE, the population is estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the same period. The city was laid out along a central axis. Mounds were arranged in deliberate spatial relationships to one another. There was a large central plaza. There were wooden post circles that archaeologists have called woodhenge, which track solar events with measurable precision. The construction of these sites required organized labor at a scale that does not emerge spontaneously. Monk's Mound alone contains an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried basket by basket over generations. The soil layers inside have been analyzed and found to be sourced from different locations, selected for specific properties at different stages of construction. That is not the behavior of a population casually piling dirt. That reflects planning, supervision, and institutional knowledge passed down across time. Further south, the mounds at Poverty Point in Louisiana push the timeline back considerably. This site dates to approximately 1700 BC, placing it in the same general period as the Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean. The earthworks at Poverty Point include a series of concentric ridges arranged in a partial octagon, covering roughly 1 square mile. For decades after its identification, mainstream archaeology struggled to accept that a hunter-gatherer society could have produced it. The physical evidence required that conclusion to be revised. What connects these sites across geography and across centuries is a set of repeated choices. The orientation toward celestial events. The use of geometric forms that require planning beyond immediate practical need. The investment of communal labor at a scale that implies social organization. The selection and transport of specific materials. These are not isolated curiosities. They are a pattern, and patterns are where careful historical investigation has to begin. What is also observable is what is missing from many of these sites today. The vast majority of the mounds that once existed in the Mississippi Valley, the Ohio Valley, and across the southeast were destroyed. Plowed under for farmland. Excavated and stripped for road fill, for building materials, for curios. Entire complexes that were documented in survey reports in the early 1800s no longer exist. We know they were there because people wrote them down. We know what was in some of them because those same people, and later professional archaeologists, recorded what they found. The physical record has gaps not because nothing was there, but because a significant portion of what was there was removed, deliberately or incidentally, within a relatively short window of time following European-American expansion into those territories. That timing matters. And the records from that period, who wrote them, what they concluded, and how those conclusions were used, are exactly where this investigation has to go next. The documentation on the mounds did not begin with professional archaeology. It began with surveyors, land agents, military officers, and early settlers who encountered these structures while moving through territory that was, in many cases, still occupied by indigenous nations. Their accounts vary widely in quality and in intent, but taken together they form a paper trail that predates the institutional narratives that would come later. One of the earliest systematic efforts to document the mounds came from the American Antiquarian Society, founded in 1812. Members of that organization, and researchers connected to it, began compiling descriptions of earthwork sites across the eastern United States. In 1820, Caleb Atwater published a survey of Western antiquities in the Society's journal that included detailed descriptions of mound complexes in Ohio. Atwater's observations were largely accurate as physical descriptions go. Where his work becomes more complicated is in his interpretation. He attributed the mounds to a separate, vanished race of people, distinct from the indigenous populations he observed around him. That conclusion would prove to be enormously influential, not because it was well supported, but because it was widely repeated. Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis published what became one of the most cited early documents on the subject, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, in 1848. This was the first publication of the newly formed Smithsonian Institution. The survey was thorough. It covered hundreds of sites, included detailed maps and measurements, and documented the contents of excavated mounds with a level of care that was genuinely scientific for its time. The physical descriptions in that volume remain useful. The interpretive conclusions, again, attributed the mounds to a lost civilization separate from living indigenous peoples. The pattern in the documentation is worth noting here. The physical observations were careful. The interpretive leap was consistent. And the direction of that leap, always away from indigenous authorship, was made in a specific historical context. These surveys were being conducted during the period of Indian removal. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1832. The forced relocations of the 5 civilized tribes occurred through the 1830s. The idea that the land being seized had once belonged to a vanished, superior race rather than to the ancestors of the people currently being removed from it was not a neutral academic conclusion. It was a conclusion with political utility. The records from the Bureau of Ethnology, established in 1879 under John Wesley Powell, mark a turning point in the documentation. Cyrus Thomas was assigned to lead a systematic investigation of the mound sites specifically to address the lost race question. His team spent years conducting fieldwork across multiple states. The report Thomas published in 1894, Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, was 730 pages long and drew on physical evidence, artifact analysis, and documented connections between excavated materials and known indigenous cultures. Thomas concluded, directly and without ambiguity, that the mounds were built by the ancestors of Native American peoples who were present at the time of European contact. He supported that conclusion with substantial documentation. That report exists. It was published by a federal institution. It was based on extensive fieldwork. And for a significant period following its publication, it did not substantially change the popular narrative around the mounds. Textbooks continued to reference the lost race theory. Museums continued to display mound artifacts in ways that disconnected them from living indigenous cultures. The gap between what the documentation showed and what the public was told is itself a documented phenomenon, not a speculation. There are also records that are harder to trace. Excavation accounts from the 18th and early 19th centuries that were never formally published. Land survey notes that described mound complexes in passing. Letters and journals from settlers that mention earthworks which no longer exist and were never professionally documented. The incompleteness of the record is partly a function of the period, when systematic documentation was not standardized. But it is also partly a function of what was considered worth preserving. Artifacts from mound excavations ended up in private collections, in European museums, and in institutional collections where their provenance was sometimes recorded carefully, and sometimes not recorded at all. What the paper trail shows, when you follow it from the early surveys through the federal investigations, is a gradual but documented shift in the institutional understanding of who built the mounds. The physical evidence consistently pointed toward indigenous authorship. The delay in that conclusion reaching the public record, and the persistence of the lost race narrative well beyond the point where it had been professionally refuted, raises questions that the documents themselves do not fully answer. Those questions become sharper when you look at where the lost race theory came from in the first place, who gave it institutional weight, and what purpose it served at the specific moment in American history when it took hold. The lost race theory did not emerge from evidence. It emerged from a prior assumption, and then evidence was selectively arranged around it. Understanding how that happened requires looking at the intellectual and political environment in which the theory took shape, because the timing is not coincidental. By the early 1800s, European-American expansion into the Ohio and Mississippi valleys was accelerating. The mounds were impossible to ignore. They were large, they were numerous, and they were clearly the product of organized human effort. The question of who built them carried immediate political weight because the answer had direct implications for land claims, for the treatment of indigenous nations, and for the broader narrative the young United States was constructing about its own origins and destiny. The lost race theory provided a specific kind of answer. It said that a superior, more civilized people had once inhabited this land, had built these remarkable structures, and had then been destroyed or displaced, possibly by the ancestors of the Native Americans currently living there. Under this framework, the indigenous peoples of the present were not the inheritors of an ancient and sophisticated civilization. They were, in the telling of the theory's proponents, latecomers or even destroyers. This reframing had obvious utility for a government actively engaged in removing those same peoples from their ancestral territories. This is the point in the record where we need to be careful about the difference between what can be documented and what can only be inferred. What can be documented is the sequence. The theory gained institutional momentum during the same decades as Indian removal. What can be documented is that prominent figures who promoted the theory were operating within institutions that had direct relationships with federal Indian policy. What can be documented is that the theory persisted in popular culture and in educational materials well after it had been professionally refuted. The causal connections between these facts involve interpretation. But the facts themselves are in the record. At this point in the video, you are more than 1 minute in. We are investigating the timeline they tried to erase. If you want to see the documents I found next video, make sure to subscribe. One of the most significant institutional promoters of the lost race theory was the early Smithsonian Institution itself, through the publications it chose to release and the frameworks it initially applied to mound research. The 1848 Squire and Davis volume, published under Smithsonian authority, gave the lost race interpretation the weight of federal institutional endorsement. That endorsement mattered in a culture that was still forming its relationship with scientific authority. Outside institutional channels, the lost race narrative was being spread through popular literature. Josiah Priest published American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West in 1833, a book that went through multiple editions and sold widely. Priest's work was speculative in the extreme, connecting the mound builders to Israelites, to Danes, to ancient Egyptians. The evidence offered was thin. The readership was large. Popular appetite for the lost race narrative was substantial, and writers and publishers were meeting that appetite without being particularly constrained by documentary standards. The religious dimension of the theory also deserves attention. The Book of Mormon, published in 1830, incorporated a version of the lost race narrative into its theological framework, describing ancient civilizations in the Americas whose ruins could be interpreted as including the mounds. This is not a statement about the religious tradition itself, but about the cultural moment. The lost race theory was circulating so widely and with such assumed credibility that it could be incorporated into a new religious text without appearing implausible to its intended audience. That tells us something about how thoroughly the narrative had saturated public thinking by the early 1830s. What is notable about the professional refutation of the theory is how thoroughly documented it was and how slowly that documentation changed the broader conversation. Cyrus Thomas published his 730-page report in 1894. The physical and artifactual evidence he compiled was extensive. His methodology was described in detail. His conclusions were clear. And yet the lost race theory continued to appear in popular books, in museum displays, and in public discourse well into the 20th century. The gap between the professional record and the public narrative is itself something the record documents. The question that this chapter leaves open is not whether the lost race theory was wrong. The professional consensus has been clear on that point for well over a century. The question worth sitting with is why a theory that was unsupported by physical evidence gained such rapid institutional momentum at a specific historical moment, and why the documented refutation of that theory traveled so much more slowly than the theory itself had. That question connects directly to the communities whose history was being rewritten, and to what their own records actually show. When Cyrus Thomas and his team were conducting their fieldwork in the 1880s, one of the methods they used to connect mound sites to specific indigenous nations was the comparison of artifacts. Objects excavated from the mounds, ceramic styles, effigy forms, ornamental designs, were compared against materials from known indigenous cultures. The connections were not ambiguous. Specific artifact types found in mounds in the Ohio Valley matched documented material cultures of nations whose descendants were still living, still identifiable, and in many cases still present in the region or in territories to which they had been relocated. The Muskogee Nation, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Natchez, these nations and others had oral traditions that spoke directly to the mounds. Not as ruins of a mysterious lost people, but as the work of their own ancestors. The Natchez people, who were encountered by French colonizers in the lower Mississippi Valley in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, were still living in a society organized around platform mounds at the time of contact. Their great son, the paramount leader, lived on a mound. Ceremonies were conducted on mounds. The connection between the mound-building tradition and the living Natchez culture was not theoretical. French colonial records documented it in real time. The Muskogee oral tradition includes specific accounts of the construction and ceremonial use of mounds. The Choctaw have oral histories that describe the construction of Naniwaya, a mound in present-day Mississippi that holds central importance in their origin narratives. Naniwaya is still a sacred site. The connection between that mound and the Choctaw people is maintained, documented, and actively asserted by the Choctaw Nation today. It is not a connection that requires inference. It is a connection that the Choctaw themselves have never relinquished. The question of why these connections were minimized or dismissed in the 19th century documentary record is answered in part by the conditions under which indigenous testimony was or was not recorded. Oral traditions were not treated as equivalent to written records in the methodological frameworks of 19th century American scholarship. Accounts from indigenous community members were sometimes recorded in ethnographic notes, but were rarely given the same institutional weight as a published survey or an academic monograph. This was not a neutral methodological choice. It reflected assumptions about what kinds of knowledge counted as evidence. There is also the disruption factor. By the time systematic ethnographic work was being conducted on mound-building traditions, many of the nations most directly connected to those traditions had been forcibly relocated. The Trail of Tears removed the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Seminole, and Chickasaw nations from their southeastern homelands in the 1830s. The communities that might have provided the most detailed oral documentation of specific mound sites were separated from those sites, in many cases permanently. The disruption of that geographic relationship did not erase the oral traditions, but it interrupted the transmission of site-specific knowledge in ways that had lasting effects on the documentary record. What survived that disruption is significant. The work of ethnographers like James Mooney, who documented Cherokee oral traditions in the late 19th century, preserved accounts that connected specific landscape features, including earthworks, to named ancestors and specific historical events as understood within Cherokee tradition. These accounts were recorded by an outside researcher working within the conventions of his time, so they carry the limitations that come with that framing. But they exist. They are in the record. And they describe a relationship between indigenous peoples and the mounds that is continuous, not disconnected. The archaeological record from the last several decades has strengthened these connections considerably. The development of techniques like radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis of human remains, and DNA studies has allowed researchers to trace population continuities across time in ways that earlier researchers could not. Studies of ancient DNA from individuals buried in mound contexts have, in multiple cases, shown genetic continuities with populations whose descendants are present-day members of specific indigenous nations. This is not a fringe finding. It has been published in peer-reviewed journals and has been incorporated into the current mainstream archaeological understanding of the mound-building cultures. What the indigenous records show, taken together, is not a mystery. They show a continuous relationship between specific communities and specific landscapes, maintained across generations through oral tradition, ceremonial practice, and physical presence. The narrative that described the mounds as the work of a vanished race was constructed in a context where indigenous testimony was systematically devalued and where the political incentives for disconnecting living people from their ancestral landscape were substantial. The records that challenged that narrative were present at the time. They were not absent from the historical moment. They were present, and they were set aside. That does not resolve every question the mounds raise. There are aspects of the archaeological record that remain genuinely incomplete, timelines that are not fully reconciled, and structural questions about specific sites that current evidence has not fully addressed. Those gaps are real, and they are worth examining honestly. Acknowledging that the mounds were built by the ancestors of indigenous Americans does not close every line of inquiry. The professional consensus on that central question is solid. But within that consensus, there are specific questions where the evidence is incomplete, where different lines of documentation point in different directions, or where the current explanations do not fully account for what the physical record shows. One of the more consistently discussed areas of incomplete explanation involves the abandonment of major sites. Cahokia, at its peak one of the largest urban centers in the pre-Columbian Americas, was substantially depopulated by around 1350 C, roughly 150 years before European contact. The reasons for that depopulation are not settled. Climate data from the period suggests a prolonged drought in the 12th and 13th centuries that would have placed significant stress on an agricultural system supporting a large population. There is also evidence of social stress in the archaeological record, changes in settlement patterns, and shifts in the material culture that suggest internal reorganization. But the specific sequence of events that led from a city of potentially 20,000 people to a largely vacant site within a few generations has not been fully reconstructed from the available evidence. This is worth naming clearly because the abandonment of Cahokia has sometimes been used in popular narratives to support the idea that the site's builders simply disappeared, feeding back into lost race thinking. The archaeological record does not support that interpretation. The populations that built and occupied Cahokia did not vanish. They dispersed. There are documented connections between Cahokia period material culture and later communities across the region. The story of what happened after Cahokia's peak is a story of movement and reorganization, not disappearance. But the detailed reconstruction of that story remains an area of active research with open questions. The scale of the Newark earthworks complex in Ohio raises questions that also remain only partially answered. The engineering precision of the site, its lunar alignments, its geometric consistency across a 4 square mile area, implies a level of institutional knowledge and long-term planning that is well established in the physical record. What is less well documented is the social structure that sustained that planning across the generations required to build and maintain the complex. The Hopewell culture, with which Newark is associated, flourished roughly between 100 BC and 500 C. The internal organization of Hopewell society, how decisions were made, how labor was coordinated, how knowledge was transmitted, is inferred from the physical evidence and from comparative analysis with documented societies. Direct documentation of the kind available for later and better recorded cultures does not exist for Hopewell. The inferences are reasonable and are supported by the material record, but they remain inferences. There are also questions about the exchange networks that connected mound building cultures across vast distances. Hopewell sites in Ohio contain copper from the Great Lakes region, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, mica from the southern Appalachians, and marine shells from the Gulf Coast. The movement of these materials across thousands of miles implies sustained long-distance relationships between communities. The mechanisms of those relationships, whether they involve dedicated traders, ceremonial exchange, political alliances, or some combination, are documented in broad outline but not in detail. How those networks were maintained, and what happened when they collapsed around 500 CE, is a question the current record answers only partially. The effigy mounds of the upper Midwest, concentrated in present-day Wisconsin, raise their own set of questions. The effigy mound culture, dating roughly from 700 CE to 1200 CE, produced mounds in the shapes of birds, bears, water spirits, and other figures across a landscape that now contains hundreds of documented examples. The meaning of the specific forms, the relationship between particular effigy types and specific locations or communities, and the ceremonial context in which the mounds were used are areas where the physical evidence is suggestive but not complete. The Ho-Chunk Nation has maintained oral traditions about the effigy mounds and has been involved in ongoing consultation with land managers and archaeologists about the interpretation and protection of these sites. The integration of that oral knowledge with the archaeological record is a process that is still developing. What is also worth noting, in closing, is that the incomplete nature of the record is itself partly a product of the history this video has covered. Mounds that were destroyed before they could be professionally documented took site-specific information with them permanently. Collections of artifacts that were removed without adequate provenance records broke the chain of evidence that would have connected objects to specific sites and communities. The gaps in what we know are not evenly distributed across time. They are concentrated in the period of rapid expansion and removal, when the physical sites and the communities connected to them were under the most pressure. None of that means the questions that remain should be dramatized or used to support frameworks the evidence does not sustain. It means that careful, ongoing work, archaeological, archival, and in genuine collaboration with indigenous communities, is the method most likely to produce better answers. The mounds are not a mystery in the sense of being inexplicable. They are the documented achievement of specific peoples across a long span of time. The parts of the story that are not yet fully told are worth pursuing through the same standards of evidence that have made the parts we do know reliable. This is a subject that rewards careful attention. The physical record is substantial. The documentary record is extensive, if uneven. The oral traditions are living. And the questions that remain open are real questions, not invitations to fill the gaps with convenient answers. What the evidence shows, and what it does not yet show, are both worth knowing.